My brother laughed at me when I was poor and forced me to be his butler. Then he lost all his money and came crawling to me. "You need to iron my underwear again. You did it wrong," my brother Gremlin said, throwing his Calvin Klein at my face while his friends laughed from the couch. "And when you're done with that, I need you to hand-feed me grapes while I play Call of Duty, because my hands are busy with the controller." I caught the underwear before it hit me and added it to the growing pile of humiliating tasks Gremlin had invented since hiring me as his personal butler 2 months before. The pay was barely minimum wage, but after getting laid off and seeing the state of the job market, I had no choice. "Don't forget to peel the grapes first," Gremlin added, his buddies howling. "And you need to say, 'Your grape, my lord,' before placing each one in my mouth." The next morning, Gremlin had me call his ex-girlfriend while he listened on speaker. "Tell her she's getting fat, and Gremlin's new girlfriend is way hotter," he said. "Tell her that Gremlin says she was boring in bed and he had to fantasize about her friends to get through it." I had to say horrible things while his ex screamed at me, and Gremlin got to feel like he'd won their breakup. Every day got worse because Gremlin kept dreaming up new ways to torture me. I became his human barbell at the gym, lying across his shoulders during squats while girls took photos, and I tried not to puke. At his college reunion, I had to follow him around telling everyone about his fake business deals while wearing a stupid earpiece that wasn't even connected to anything. The really sick part was that Gremlin got all his money from our grandmother, who left me nothing because she thought Gremlin was going places. Now those places included making me warm his toilet seat every morning and using me as a footstool during his stupid podcast about how everyone else was lazy. He'd actually prop his feet on my back while recording himself talking about work ethic and grinding for success, and his listeners had no idea their guru was inherited money trash who'd never worked a day in his life. He made me go to restaurants before him to ask if they were fancy enough for the great Gremlin. He had me call every girl who'd ever dumped him to tell them they were ugly now. I had to tip valets with my own cash while making sure everyone heard me thanking them for Gremlin. My own money, going into strangers' pockets, just so people would think my brother wasn't cheap. Some nights I'd lie in my crappy apartment staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd gone from a marketing manager with a future to a 30-year-old man who spent his days pretending to be furniture. My college friends were getting promotions and buying houses while I was learning the perfect temperature for Gremlin's toilet seat. The contract he'd made me sign was airtight, because Gremlin's lawyer friend made sure of that. I sent out job applications between peeling grapes and ironing underwear. I wrote cover letters while Gremlin used me as a coat rack at parties. I did phone interviews in my car during my lunch breaks, which I spent eating peanut butter sandwiches because I couldn't afford anything else. One interviewer asked why I'd left my last position, and I had to make up some story about downsizing, while Gremlin texted me demanding I come back inside to hold his protein shake during his conference call. Finally, a marketing firm called back. $90,000 a year, starting now. I gave Gremlin my 2 weeks while he was literally standing on my back, trying to reach something on a high shelf. "Whatever," he said. "Plenty more losers where you came from." 8 months later, I had my life back. Real apartment, real food, a girlfriend who thought I was normal. I almost forgot what Gremlin's toilet seat felt like. Then Gremlin called at midnight, crying so hard I could barely understand him. We met at a diner where he looked like death had sucked out his soul and spit back the husk. "I invested everything in this cryptocurrency called Moon Rocket," he said, his hands shaking so bad he could barely hold his coffee. "This Instagram model with 13 million followers said her boyfriend was a crypto genius insider. She DM'd me personally and said I was special." My brain broke trying to process this. "You gave all your money to some random IG girl? She guaranteed 10,000% returns, and I sold the house and emptied the trust fund, and now the website's gone, and I have $17 total." His voice went up like a little kid's. "I'm living in my car and eating ketchup packets for dinner." I stirred my coffee real slow, enjoying every second of watching him squirm like I'd squirmed for months. "Please," he begged, grabbing my wrist with his clammy hands. "You have to help me." "I'll help you, Gremlin," I said, pulling out my phone. "But I think you know what you're going to have to do to get money from me." I opened up Amazon Prime and typed in French maid costume. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The morning after the diner, I sat on my couch staring at the cardboard box on my coffee table. Amazon Prime had delivered it at 7 in the morning, and now the French maid costume just sat there like a loaded gun waiting to go off. I picked up the package and turned it over in my hands, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. My brain kept replaying every single time Gremlin made me warm his toilet seat before he sat down. Every morning I had to kneel there with my hand on the porcelain, waiting for it to reach the exact temperature he wanted. I remembered being his footstool during those stupid podcast recordings, while he talked about work ethic to his followers, who had no idea he'd never worked a real day in his life. The vindication running through my body felt better than anything I'd felt in months. I opened the package and pulled out the costume, holding up the frilly black and white fabric. Gremlin was going to put this on, and he was going to clean my apartment, and he was going to know exactly what humiliation felt like. My phone rang at 9, and Gremlin's name popped up on the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering because I wanted him to sweat a little. His voice came through hollow and shaky like he'd been crying again. He asked if my offer last night was actually serious, or if I'd just been messing with him. I could hear cars in the background and the beeping of a gas pump, and I pictured him standing in some parking lot with $17 to his name. I told him to come over at noon, so we could talk about terms. He asked what kind of terms, and I said he'd find out when he got here. The power in my voice felt amazing, like I was finally the one calling the shots after months of being treated like furniture. He agreed to come, and I hung up without saying goodbye. At 11:30, I started getting the apartment ready. I put the costume box on the coffee table where he'd see it right when he walked in. I made sure my place looked good, way better than his old house ever did, because I wanted him to see what actual earned success looked like compared to his grandmother's handout money. I checked my bank account on my phone and saw the $90,000 salary sitting there as proof that I'd rebuilt my life the right way. My girlfriend was at work and wouldn't be home until later, which was probably good, because I needed to handle this conversation alone. Gremlin showed up at noon looking worse than he had at the diner. He wore the same wrinkled shirt and jeans from last night, and his hair stuck up in greasy clumps. The smell hit me when I opened the door, that sour, unwashed smell of someone living in their car. I stepped back and told him to use my bathroom and clean up first. He looked surprised, like he expected me to make him grovel right away. I pointed down the hall and said I'd make him a sandwich while he showered. He walked past me without saying anything, and I heard the bathroom door close. While the water ran, I made a turkey sandwich with actual fresh bread and real turkey, not the cheap stuff, because I could afford it now. I put chips on the plate too, and poured a glass of actual orange juice. This felt generous, giving him basic human dignity before we got into the real conversation. He came out 20 minutes later with wet hair and my towel wrapped around his shoulders. I handed him the plate, and he sat on my couch eating like he hadn't seen real food in days. I sat across from him in my nice chair and waited until he finished the sandwich. Then I leaned forward and started laying out how this was going to work. Any money I gave him would come with work requirements, and that work would involve the same kind of tasks he made me do. I pointed at the costume box on the table. His eyes went to it, and his jaw got tight, but he didn't stand up or walk out. We both knew he had absolutely nowhere else to go. I told him every dollar would be earned through humiliation, just like he made me earn my minimum wage paycheck. He stared at the box, and I watched his face turn red. The front door opened, and my girlfriend walked in early from her shift at the hospital. She stopped when she saw Gremlin on our couch looking miserable in my borrowed clothes. Her eyes went from him to me to the costume box, and I saw her expression change. She asked if she could talk to me in the bedroom real quick. I followed her down the hall, and she closed the door behind us. She asked what exactly I was planning here, and her tone made it super clear she wasn't comfortable with whatever revenge thing I was setting up. I tried to explain that this was just about fair consequences. She crossed her arms and said, "There's a difference between setting boundaries and becoming the person who hurt you." That made me defensive because I wasn't ready to hear it. I told her Gremlin deserved this after what he put me through. She said she understood I was hurt, but this wasn't the way to fix it. We went back and forth for a few minutes until she checked her phone and said she had to get to her evening class. She looked at me one more time before leaving, and I knew she was disappointed. After she left, I went back to the living room where Gremlin still sat on the couch. I picked up the costume box and dropped it on the coffee table in front of him. I told him he could earn $200 by cleaning my entire apartment in this costume tomorrow afternoon. He stared at the box for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked up at me with this expression of pure hatred that actually made me feel powerful instead of small for the first time since I'd escaped his employment. He asked if I was serious, and I said completely serious. He could wear the costume and clean, or he could go back to his car and figure out his own life. He agreed with his teeth clenched, and I felt this rush of satisfaction. I told him to come back tomorrow at 2 and to bring his appetite for humble pie. The next afternoon, my doorbell rang at exactly 2. I opened it, and Gremlin stood there with the costume in a plastic bag. He walked past me without looking at my face. I pointed to the bathroom and told him to change. He went in and closed the door, and I heard him moving around in there for a while. When he came out, his face was bright red with shame. The black and white frilly dress looked ridiculous on him, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. I handed him cleaning supplies and told him to start with the kitchen. He walked over and got on his knees to scrub the floor. I pulled out my phone and took a few pictures, just for my own satisfaction at first. Then I opened my close friend's story and posted one with the caption, "Karma is a maid," before I could think better of it. The rush of posting it felt incredible. While he scrubbed my kitchen floor, I walked over and stood above him. I told him I needed collateral for any money I might loan him, and I wanted his gaming PC. He stopped scrubbing and looked up at me. He said that was the only valuable thing he had left. I reminded him that I had to give up my dignity for 8 months, and a gaming PC was nothing compared to that. He argued that he needed it to make money streaming or selling it later. I said if he wanted any financial help from me, the PC was coming to my apartment today. He went back to scrubbing without answering, but I knew he'd agree because he had no other options. After he finished the kitchen, I made him do the bathroom and the living room. Every time I walked past him, I felt this surge of power. That evening after he left, I sat on my couch and went through all the photos on my phone. The images of him in that ridiculous costume scrubbing my floors made me feel vindicated in a way I hadn't felt in years. I opened the group chat with 3 friends who knew everything Gremlin had put me through. I sent them the best photo, the one where you could really see his face red with shame. Their responses came back fast with laughing emojis and messages saying he finally got what he deserved. One friend wrote YESSS with like 10 exclamation points. Another said I was a legend for making this happen. The third sent a gif of someone doing a victory dance. I read through their messages feeling completely justified, like the universe had finally balanced itself out and I was the one holding the scales. The next morning my phone rang at 7 and Gremlin's name lit up the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and the sound that came through wasn't his usual voice at all. He was crying hard, like actually sobbing into the phone, and I could hear him trying to catch his breath between words. He told me he'd been having panic attacks in his car at night, waking up sweating and shaking and not knowing where he was for a few seconds. He admitted he'd been sleeping in the grocery store parking lot because they had security cameras, and he felt safer there, and every morning he went inside to use their bathroom to brush his teeth and wash his face in the sink. For just a second, I felt something that might have been pity, this weird pulling feeling in my chest, but I pushed it down hard and told him to come over so we could figure out an actual plan. He showed up 2 hours later looking even worse than before, and I pointed him to my laptop on the kitchen table. We spent the whole afternoon sitting there drafting an agreement, me typing while he stared at the screen with red eyes. The terms were simple. He had to do job applications every single day with proof, perform reasonable household tasks without the costume stuff, and I would give him small loans with clear repayment schedules tied to whatever future job he got. He nodded at everything and signed his name at the bottom when we finished, and I saved the document feeling like maybe this was how adults handled things, instead of whatever revenge game I'd been playing. My girlfriend came home around 5 and saw us at the table, and I showed her the agreement thinking she'd be proud of how mature and organized it all looked. She read through it slow, her face not showing much, then asked if she could talk to me in the bedroom for a minute. I followed her in, and she closed the door, then turned around and said, I needed to decide right now whether I wanted revenge or whether I actually wanted to help him, because mixing the two together was going to blow up in my face and probably damage our relationship too. I told her this was about justice, that Gremlin owed me for what he did, and this was just making things fair. She gave me this look, her eyes going sort of sad and tired at the same time, and I could tell she didn't believe there was any real difference between justice and revenge in this situation. She didn't push it any further, though, just said okay, and went back to the living room, and I knew she was backing off, because she could see I wasn't ready to hear what she was really trying to tell me. 2 days later, I was sitting at my desk at work, when Brad from accounting walked by and leaned over to show me his phone. My stomach dropped like an elevator with cut cables when I saw the screenshot, because it was the maid costume photo, and Brad said it had been making rounds through some group chats. Within an hour, my desk phone rang, and it was Tucker from HR asking me to come to his office right away. I walked down there feeling my heart pound in my ears, and Tucker closed the door behind me and pulled up the photo on his computer. He asked if I understood how off-hours conduct could affect workplace reputation, his voice all professional and cold, and I felt my face burning hot with shame. I pulled out my phone right there and started deleting the story and all the photos, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped it twice. I promised Tucker this was a private family matter that wouldn't happen again, the words coming out fast and desperate, and he gave me an official warning about maintaining professional standards even outside work hours. I left his office feeling like the walls were closing in from all sides, like my whole rebuilt life was balanced on a knife edge because I'd wanted to humiliate my brother. That evening, Gremlin called asking for a bigger loan because his car had broken down and he needed it fixed to do delivery work. I told him any money beyond basic survival stuff had to come with daily proof of job applications, actual screenshots of the submissions, and he agreed, but I could see the resentment building in his eyes through the phone screen. It was the same look he used to get right before he'd invent some new horrible task for me, and I wondered if I was just creating a different version of the same toxic cycle. The next afternoon, my girlfriend texted me while I was in a meeting, and when I checked my phone, I saw she'd sent a screenshot of a message Gremlin had sent her. The message said something about me being such a great brother with these little sarcastic comments that made it obvious he was trying to make me look just as bad as he'd been. I felt my face get hot with anger and embarrassment, this burning feeling spreading across my cheeks, because he was trying to poison my relationship now and drag her into our mess. When I got home that evening, she was waiting on the couch with her arms crossed, and she said she didn't sign up to be part of this toxic thing between us brothers. I got defensive immediately, telling her I was just holding him accountable for what he did, but she cut me off and said, "Accountability doesn't look like humiliation and power games." She said if I couldn't see the difference between helping someone and getting revenge, then we had a real problem, and her voice had this edge to it that scared me more than anything Tucker had said. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Wyatt that made my blood run cold, just sitting there on my lock screen when I grabbed my phone. The message said, if the public humiliation continued, he would file harassment claims on Gremlin's behalf, and it was written in this formal lawyer language that made it clear he wasn't joking around. I lay there staring at the ceiling, realizing how fast this whole thing could turn into legal problems, actual court stuff that would destroy the career I'd worked. So hard to rebuild, and all the satisfaction from seeing Gremlin in that costume suddenly felt hollow and stupid and dangerous. Tucker's email came through at 10 that morning, asking me to come back to his office at 2 for a formal discussion about workplace conduct standards. I spent my lunch break in my car eating a sandwich I couldn't taste, while my stomach twisted itself into knots, thinking about how one stupid photo could end everything I'd rebuilt. At 2 sharp, I walked into Tucker's office, and he had this official-looking folder on his desk with my name on it, and I knew this was serious, in a way the first warning wasn't. He pulled out a document about personal conduct policies and how employee behavior outside work hours can reflect on the company's reputation and values. I had to read through 3 pages of policy language about social media guidelines and professional standards while he sat there watching me, and I felt like I was back in the school getting called to the principal's office. The worst part was signing the acknowledgement form that went into my permanent file, my hand shaking as I wrote my name, because I knew one more incident would mean immediate termination. Tucker walked me through the escalation process in this calm voice that somehow made it scarier, explaining how the next step would be suspension without pay, followed by termination if the behavior continued. I left his office feeling like my entire career was balanced on a knife edge, and all because I wanted to humiliate my brother the way he humiliated me. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, researching loan agreements and harassment laws until my eyes burned from staring at the screen. The legal websites used all this language about emotional distress and hostile environments, and I kept seeing ways the costume thing could be twisted into something that would get me sued. I found case law about workplace retaliation and public humiliation claims and realized how easily Wyatt could build a harassment case if I kept pushing. The vindictive satisfaction from seeing Gremlin in that costume started mixing with genuine fear as I read about settlements and legal fees that could wipe out everything I'd saved. I made notes about proper loan documentation and collateral requirements, trying to figure out how to help him without crossing into territory that could destroy me. Around midnight, I finally closed my laptop and sat there in the dark, wondering how helping my brother had turned into this legal minefield, where every move I made could blow up my life. The next morning, I texted Gremlin to meet me at the coffee shop on 5th Street at 9 so we could handle this properly with actual documentation. He showed up looking nervous and suspicious, like he thought I was going to spring some new humiliation on him, but I just pulled out the loan agreement template I'd drafted. We spent an hour filling in terms and numbers, setting up a repayment schedule of $50 per week once he had steady income, documenting his gaming PC as collateral worth roughly $800. The whole thing felt businesslike and boring compared to the revenge fantasy I'd been enjoying, but at least it was legally sound and wouldn't land me in court or cost me my job. Gremlin read through every line twice before signing, and I could see him relaxing as he realized this was just money stuff, without any costume requirements or public shaming. We both signed, and I made copies on my phone, sending one to my email and one to his, creating a paper trail that would hold up if things went sideways later. After we finished the paperwork, I told him he could crash on my couch for a while if he followed some basic house rules. He had to submit proof of 5 job applications every day, do his own laundry and dishes, keep his stuff contained to the living room area, and absolutely no contact with my girlfriend beyond polite greetings when she came home. Gremlin agreed immediately because sleeping on a couch beat sleeping in his car, and I could see the relief wash over his face, even though he tried to hide it. We drove to the parking lot where he'd been staying and loaded his stuff into my car, just 2 garbage bags of clothes and some toiletries and his phone charger. Back at my apartment, I set him up with a pillow and blanket and showed him where everything was while feeling my space shrink around me. That first night, I lay in my bedroom hearing him move around in the living room and wondered how long I could handle having him here before the walls closed in completely. 2 weeks crawled by with Gremlin sending me screenshots of job applications every evening and doing basic chores without complaint. He got signed up with a delivery app and seemed genuinely excited about the income potential, talking about how he could make decent money if he worked the dinner rush every night. On his second day, he called me at work, and I stepped outside to take it, hearing traffic noise and panic in his voice. His car had broken down on some side street, and he was freaking out because without the car, he couldn't do deliveries, and without deliveries, he had no way to make money. I could hear the desperation mixed with humiliation as he asked if I could help, his voice going quiet and small, like it hurt him to even say the words. I told him to text me the location and the mechanic's estimate, and I'd figure something out. Then I stood outside my office building feeling the weight of being responsible for another adult who couldn't handle basic life problems. The mechanic said it would cost $350 to fix the alternator and get the car running again. I met Gremlin at the shop that evening and told him I'd cover it as an advance on the loan, but we needed to add stricter terms about repayment and interest. He accepted without arguing, because he needed the car to make any money at all, and we both knew he had no other options. While we waited for the repair, I drafted an addendum to our agreement on my phone, adding the $350 to his total debt and bumping the weekly payment to $75 once he had income. Gremlin signed it right there in the grimy waiting room, and I realized I was starting to feel less like I was getting revenge and more like I was just managing a bad situation that would probably never really get resolved. 3 days later, I was eating breakfast before work when my phone buzzed with an email from Wyatt Gallegos, and my stomach dropped before I even opened it. The email had actual legal letterhead and formal language about harassment laws and public humiliation statutes. Wyatt laid out specific examples of how the costume photos could constitute emotional distress and reputational damage, citing actual case numbers and legal precedents that made it clear he'd done his research. He said any further public shaming or social media posts would result in formal legal action, including restraining orders and civil suits for damages. The email was professional and terrifying in how specific it was about the laws I'd been close to breaking, making it obvious that one more photo or post could result in actual court dates and legal fees I couldn't afford. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling my face get hot with fear, thinking about how my stupid revenge plan had put me one step away from being sued. I called Gremlin that afternoon and told him the costume stuff was completely done, no more public humiliation, everything from here on out stayed private and focused on getting him back on his feet. He sounded relieved and kind of surprised, like he'd expected me to push back harder or demand something in return. I explained that I was more afraid of losing my job than I was interested in revenge anymore, and he actually laughed this bitter laugh that said he understood exactly how that felt. We agreed to stick to the loan terms and house rules without any extra punishment games, keeping everything simple and legal so neither of us ended up in court. After I hung up, I felt this weird mix of relief and disappointment, like I'd wanted him to suffer more, but I was also exhausted from the constant tension of waiting for everything to explode. Instead of making him do humiliating tasks, I told him he needed to make private apology calls to 3 people he'd wronged during his power trip phase. Gremlin resisted at first, saying he didn't see the point of dredging up old stuff, but I explained that if he wanted to stay on my couch, he needed to clean up some of the damage he'd caused. He eventually agreed, and I sat there on the other end of my apartment while he called his ex-girlfriend to apologize for all the horrible things I'd been forced to say to her on his behalf. I could hear his voice going quiet and careful as he explained that he'd been a different person back then, and he was sorry for using me to hurt her. She asked questions, and he answered them, and for a few minutes it actually sounded like a real conversation between 2 people trying to be honest with each other. Then the call went completely sideways when she started asking what was happening with him now and why he was suddenly apologizing after months of silence. Gremlin got nervous and started explaining about the crypto thing and living with me, and she asked if I was making him do this call. He panicked and said something about how I was helping him, but also making him jump through hoops, and suddenly I could hear her voice getting louder, asking if I was abusing him or holding money over his head. Gremlin tried to backtrack, but he kept saying things that made it sound like I was the bad guy now, talking about loan terms and requirements in a way that painted me as some controlling jerk. She said she was going to post about this on social media because people needed to know what kind of person I really was, and Gremlin begged her not to, while I sat there feeling my whole world about to explode publicly, in a way that would make both of us look terrible and destroy whatever was left of my reputation. I grabbed the phone from Gremlin's hand before he could say anything else stupid and hung up on his ex. Gremlin stared at me with this shocked expression, like I'd just slapped him across the face, but I didn't care, because watching my entire professional life get destroyed on social media wasn't an option. My hands shook as I blocked her number on his phone, and then made him delete every single contact he had for her, including her friends and her sister. He tried to argue that I was overreacting, but I told him to shut up and let me think, because one of us needed to actually use our brain for once. I paced around my apartment trying to figure out damage control, while Gremlin sat on the couch looking miserable and useless. My girlfriend came home 20 minutes later and found me still pacing with Gremlin hunched over like someone had kicked him in the stomach. She asked what happened, and I explained the whole mess about the apology call going wrong and the ex threatening to post everything online. Instead of freaking out like I expected, she just nodded and pulled out her laptop, without saying anything about how I'd screwed up. She spent the next hour researching while I sat there feeling like a kid waiting to get yelled at by the principal. Finally, she turned the screen toward us and showed a list of job fairs happening in the area, including one next Tuesday that had temp agencies and warehouse companies looking for workers. Then she pulled up this budgeting app that tracked spending and income automatically and sent the link to both our phones. She also found a list of low-cost therapy options, including some sliding scale places that charged based on what you could actually afford to pay. I felt myself getting defensive because it seemed like she was taking over the whole situation and making decisions without asking me first. But then I looked at what I'd been doing, which was making Gremlin apologize to people and playing power games, and I realized her approach was probably way healthier than anything I'd come up with. Gremlin actually perked up a little looking at the job fair information, even though he made this face like someone was forcing him to eat garbage. He agreed to go, but made sure we both knew he thought it was beneath him to stand in line with regular people looking for regular jobs. I told him beggars can't be choosers, and watched him flinch like I'd hit him with something heavy. The satisfaction felt good for about 2 seconds before the guilt kicked in, because I was still taking shots at him even when I was supposedly trying to help. My girlfriend gave me this look that said she noticed exactly what I'd just done, and I felt like a jerk for enjoying his pain even a little bit. Tuesday morning, we drove to the convention center where the job fair was happening, and the parking lot was already packed with cars. Inside, there were probably 200 people walking around with resumes talking to recruiters at different booths. Gremlin walked next to me with his hands shoved in his pockets, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. We stopped at a booth for a warehouse staffing agency, and the recruiter started explaining their positions when Gremlin made this comment loud enough for people nearby to hear about how his brother was really enjoying dragging him to this. Several people turned to look at us, including this woman named Megan, who was running the whole event and happened to be walking past right at that moment. My face burned hot with embarrassment as Megan glanced over with this expression that said she'd heard everything and was judging both of us. I wanted to explain that Gremlin was just being a jerk, and I was actually trying to help him, but that would have made everything worse. So I just stood there feeling like everyone in the building knew I was somehow both the victim and the bad guy. We moved to the next booth, and I kept my distance from Gremlin, hoping people would think we weren't together. Then I saw Tucker from my company's HR department standing at a recruiting table for our marketing division. My stomach dropped because Tucker was the last person I needed to see right now, given everything that had already happened with the warnings and the written documentation. He looked up and made direct eye contact with me, then glanced at Gremlin, who was standing there radiating resentment like a toxic cloud. Tucker didn't say anything, but he pulled out his phone and typed something, and I knew without a doubt this was going to come up in another HR conversation that I absolutely could not afford to have. We finished walking through the fair, and Gremlin picked up applications from 3 different temp agencies before we left. The whole drive home, I kept thinking about Tucker's face and that note he'd made on his phone, and wondering if I was about to lose my job over family drama. That evening, I sat Gremlin down at my kitchen table and pulled out our loan agreement on my laptop. I added a new section that said any bad comments about me in public or private would end all financial support immediately, with no second chances. Gremlin read through it, and I watched his jaw get tight and his shoulders tense up like he was holding back about 50 things he wanted to say. He signed it anyway because what choice did he have, but I could see the anger building up inside him like pressure in a bottle. I wondered if I was just creating this situation where everything would eventually blow up worse than if I'd just let him say whatever he wanted. But I also knew I couldn't keep helping him if he was going to trash talk me to my girlfriend or make scenes in public that could cost me my career. My girlfriend made dinner while we finished the paperwork, and nobody said much of anything because the tension in the apartment was thick enough to choke on. Gremlin went to sleep on the couch early, and I lay in bed next to my girlfriend, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how none of this felt like winning, even though I was supposed to be the one in control now. A week went by with Gremlin doing his job applications and keeping his mouth shut about everything. Then one afternoon, I was in the bedroom changing clothes after work when I heard him talking to my girlfriend in the living room. His voice had this sarcastic edge as he made some comment about my control issues and how I needed everything done exactly my way. I froze with my shirt halfway off and listened to him go on about how I was just as bad as he used to be, except I pretended it was for his own good. My girlfriend didn't respond, but I could picture her face and the awkward silence that was probably filling the room. I walked out into the living room and told Gremlin to pack his stuff right now and get out. He started to argue, but I cut him off and said he could spend the night in his car, thinking about whether he wanted to follow the rules or be homeless. My girlfriend looked shocked and started to say something, but I was too angry to listen to anyone. Gremlin grabbed his backpack and the garbage bag with his clothes and walked out without another word. I slammed the door behind him and stood there, breathing hard, trying to convince myself I'd done the right thing. My girlfriend asked if that was really necessary, and I told her the agreement was clear and he'd violated it, so this was on him, not me. She didn't argue, but she also didn't agree, and I could feel the space growing between us over how I was handling everything. An hour later, my phone started buzzing with texts from Gremlin. The first one just said sorry, and the second one begged me to let him come back inside. Then they kept coming one after another saying he'd messed up and he wouldn't do it again, and please give him another chance. I sat on my couch reading them and not responding while my girlfriend watched TV and pretended not to notice. 2 hours passed and the texts got more desperate, with Gremlin saying it was cold in his car and he was scared and he didn't know what else to do. 3 hours in, and I was sitting there trying to figure out if I was being firm about boundaries or just being mean because I could be. The line between appropriate consequences and cruelty felt impossible to find, and I kept going back and forth in my head about what the right move was. My girlfriend finally said I should at least respond, so he knew I wasn't ignoring him forever, and I realized she was probably right. I opened my phone and started typing, but I didn't want to just let him back in like nothing had happened, because then the clause meant nothing. I called him instead of texting and told him I had a different option to discuss. There was this place called a sober house about 15 minutes away that had shared rooms and a structured program for people trying to get their lives together. I'd looked it up during the 3 hours of silence, and the first month cost $800, which I could cover as part of the loan. It wasn't my couch, but it wasn't his car either, and it came with rules and check-ins from people who weren't emotionally involved in our mess. Gremlin asked if I was serious about making him live with strangers in some group home situation, and I told him those were his options right now. He could take the sober house, and I'd pay the first month while he got steady work, or he could figure everything out on his own starting tonight. The phone went quiet for a long time before he said he'd think about it and hung up. I felt this weird combination of relief that he wasn't on my couch anymore, and disappointment that I didn't get to watch him suffer more, mixed with total exhaustion from the constant fighting. The next morning, Wyatt called Gremlin while I was at work, and I only found out about it later when Gremlin texted me that his lawyer friend thought the sober house was a good idea. Wyatt had apparently told him that living with me was making everything worse for both of us, and some distance might actually help. Gremlin agreed to check out the place, and I drove him there that afternoon to meet with the house manager. The building was old but clean, with 6 bedrooms and a shared kitchen and living room. The manager explained their rules about curfews and house meetings and random drug tests, even though Gremlin wasn't using anything. Gremlin signed the intake paperwork and moved his stuff into a room with 2 beds and a dresser that he'd be sharing with some guy who worked night shifts. I paid the first month and left, feeling like I should be happy about the separation, but instead, I just felt tired and kind of empty. My girlfriend said I'd made the right call when I got home, and I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just passed my problem off to someone else instead of actually solving anything. 2 days later, Gremlin called to tell me he'd gotten placed in a warehouse position through one of the temp agencies from the job fair. The supervisor's name was Jason, and the work involved loading trucks and moving inventory around for $8 an hour. It wasn't much money, but it was 40 hours a week, with the possibility of overtime and actual paychecks instead of just promises. Gremlin sounded tired but also kind of proud when he described getting the offer, and I realized this was probably the first real job he'd ever gotten on his own, without family connections or inheritance money smoothing the way. The work was physical and the pay was basic, but it came with structure and expectations and the chance to build something real instead of just living off what grandmother had left him. I told him that was good news, and meant it, even though part of me was still angry about everything that had happened. He started the following Monday, and I went back to focusing on my own job and my relationship, and trying to pretend the last few months hadn't completely wrecked my sense of who I was supposed to be. The next week, I called Gremlin and told him we needed to talk about how this arrangement was going to work long term. We met at a diner near the warehouse, and I laid out the new plan over coffee and fries that I paid for because he was still broke. No more costume stuff. No more humiliating tasks designed to make him feel small. Just weekly check-ins where we'd go over his budget and make sure he was managing money responsibly. He stared at me across the table looking confused and suspicious, like he was waiting for me to pull out some new twisted requirement. I explained that the revenge stuff wasn't helping either of us, and we needed something that could actually last instead of just making each other miserable. He nodded slowly and asked what the catch was, and I told him there wasn't one, just weekly meetings and proof he was trying to get his life together. His shoulders relaxed a tiny bit, but his eyes still had that guarded look like he didn't quite believe this was real. 6 days into his warehouse job, I was sitting at my desk reviewing a marketing campaign when my phone buzzed with a message from an old college friend. The preview showed an image attachment, and when I opened it, my stomach dropped straight through the floor. The maid costume photo was back, forwarded through some group chat I wasn't part of with a caption about karma and rich kids getting what they deserve. My hands started shaking as I scrolled through the message thread and realized this thing was spreading way beyond the small circle I'd originally shared it with. Someone had screenshot it and sent it to their friends who sent it to their friends, and now it was loose in the world completely out of my control. I immediately started damage control, sending messages to everyone I could think of asking them to delete it, but the replies came back, saying it was already in multiple group chats, and there was no way to stop it now. My heart was racing as I thought about Tucker seeing it again, or worse, someone higher up in the company getting forwarded this photo of me, publicly humiliating my brother. 2 hours later, my desk phone rang, and it was Tucker asking me to come to his office right away. I walked down the hall feeling like I was going to puke, knowing exactly what this was about before I even sat down. Tucker pulled out a printed copy of the photo that someone had sent to the general HR email and asked if I understood how serious this situation had become. He explained that the company had received multiple complaints about my conduct and that this was going in my permanent file as a written warning. One more incident related to this situation, and I was done, terminated, career over. I signed the warning document with shaking hands while Tucker talked about professional standards and personal conduct policies. Walking back to my desk, I felt like my entire life was balanced on the edge of a cliff because I couldn't let go of getting revenge on my brother. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone and seriously thinking about just cutting Gremlin off completely. Let him figure out his own problems, let him sink or swim on his own, stop risking everything I'd built just to feel like I'd evened the score. My girlfriend came home from work and found me like that, staring at nothing, and when I told her what I was thinking, she said that actually sounded reasonable given the stress this was causing. But something in me resisted the idea of just abandoning him, even though part of me still wanted to watch him suffer. She sat down next to me and said I needed to make a choice about what kind of person I wanted to be, because right now, I was stuck between helping and hurting, and it was destroying both of us. The next evening, she sat me down at the kitchen table with this serious look on her face that made my chest tight. She said she was giving me an ultimatum, and I needed to listen carefully because she meant every word. No more revenge games, no more power trips, just clear boundaries and actual help, or she was done with the relationship. I agreed immediately, without even thinking, because losing her would hurt way more than any satisfaction I could get from making Gremlin miserable. She'd been the only stable thing keeping me sane through all this chaos, and I realized how close I'd come to throwing that away just to feel powerful. We sat there holding hands while I promised to be better, and actually meant it this time. I texted Gremlin asking him to meet me at a coffee shop the next afternoon. When he showed up looking tired and wary, I took a deep breath and apologized for the humiliating tasks and the costume and everything I'd done, trying to make him feel what I felt. I acknowledged that I'd crossed lines and become the kind of person who hurt others just because I'd been hurt. He looked shocked, his mouth actually hanging open for a second before he recovered. He didn't accept the apology exactly, just kind of nodded and said he understood, but he agreed we could try keeping things purely about logistics going forward with clear boundaries on both sides. We shook hands awkwardly like business partners instead of brothers, and I felt this weird sense of relief mixed with sadness about what we'd become. 2 weeks passed, and I got a text from Gremlin with a photo of a $50 bill and a message saying this was his first loan repayment from his warehouse paycheck. It wasn't much money, but it represented something real, actual progress instead of just promises and threats. I deposited the cash and sent him a receipt, feeling this cautious hope that maybe we were actually moving towards something that could work long term. The cycle of humiliation was breaking and being replaced with something boring and functional, which felt like success, even though it wasn't satisfying the way revenge had been. The following Saturday, we met at a bank branch to open a basic checking account with automatic deductions for loan repayment. The bank employee walked us through the paperwork and account setup, probably thinking we were business partners based on how formal and distant we acted with each other. In a weird way, that's kind of what we were becoming. Two people with a financial arrangement, instead of brothers with years of resentment and betrayal between us. The automatic deductions would take the emotional negotiation out of repayment, just clean transactions that happened whether we were fighting or not. I left the bank feeling like I could actually breathe without waiting for the next crisis to explode. A few days later, Wyatt called me and said he'd drafted a simple consent document confirming that both parties agreed to end any humiliating conditions and stick to the repayment plan. We met at his office and signed the papers while a notary watched and stamped everything official. Having it all documented made the agreement feel real and binding in a way that our previous arrangements never had. I kept my copy in a folder at home and felt this sense of relief that we'd finally put legal structure around something that had been purely emotional warfare. The document meant I could stop waiting for Gremlin to find some new way to manipulate the situation or for me to cross another line that would destroy my career. A month into the warehouse job, I was at work when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The house manager from Gremlin's sober house was calling to tell me that Gremlin had missed a shift because he overslept and was now in danger of losing his room. The house had strict rules about maintaining employment, and if he couldn't keep his job, they'd have to give his spot to someone else on the waiting list. She asked if I'd be willing to cover another week's rent to give him time to sort things out with his supervisor. I stood there in the hallway outside my office trying to decide whether to bail him out again or let him face the natural consequences of his own screw-up. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before I called the house manager back and told her I wasn't covering any more rent. She asked if I was sure, and I said yes. Gremlin needed to handle this himself, or the pattern would just keep repeating forever. Then I texted Gremlin that he was on his own for the housing situation and he needed to talk to his supervisor about making up the missed shift. His response came back immediately, with about 15 exclamation points and words I won't repeat, followed by 3 calls I didn't answer because I knew if I heard his voice, I might cave. My hands were shaking when I put my phone away and went back to my desk, trying to focus on the marketing report I was supposed to finish by end of day. 3 days went by without hearing anything, and I started wondering if I'd pushed too hard and he was back in his car eating ketchup packets. Then my phone buzzed with a text that just said he'd worked it out with Jason. I called him during my lunch break, and he sounded completely exhausted, his voice rough like he hadn't slept much. He told me Jason let him switch to overnight shifts for 2 weeks to make up the hours he'd missed, which meant working his regular day shifts plus overnights on top of that. I asked if he could handle that schedule, and he said he didn't have a choice, but there was something different in his tone. Not the usual resentment or manipulation, just this tired kind of pride that he'd actually solved a problem by himself instead of crying to me or throwing money at it or finding some angle to work. The following Monday, Tucker called me into his office, and I felt my stomach drop because I thought something new had surfaced. But he just opened a folder, showed me the written warning that would stay in my file, and said the matter was closed as long as nothing else came up. I thanked him probably 5 times and promised my personal life would never touch work again, feeling this huge wave of relief that I'd barely escaped something that could have destroyed everything I'd rebuilt. Walking back to my desk, I realized how close I'd come to throwing away my career just to get revenge on Gremlin, and how stupid that would have been considering where I was 8 months ago. That Friday, my girlfriend made pasta for dinner, and we ate at my actual table instead of on the couch like usual. She told me she was proud of how I'd handled the last few weeks, setting boundaries instead of playing power games. I could tell she was still watching me carefully, and I knew our relationship was basically on probation too, but something felt different between us. Less tense, more like we were actually on the same team, instead of her constantly having to talk me down from doing something destructive. We did the dishes together, and she stayed over, and it felt normal in a way it hadn't, since Gremlin showed up broke in that diner. About a week later, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone around midnight when Gremlin called. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and we ended up talking for over an hour about stuff we'd never really discussed before. He brought up how grandmother always treated him like he was special and destined for greatness, while basically ignoring me, and how that messed both of us up in different ways. I told him it made me feel worthless, and him feel entitled, and he actually agreed instead of getting defensive. There was no big emotional moment or tears or anything like that, just 2 people finally acknowledging the facts of what happened and how it poisoned everything between us from the start. We didn't forgive each other or suddenly become close, but something shifted just from saying it all out loud. 2 weeks after that conversation, Gremlin sent me a photo of a receipt from a pawn shop. He'd sold his fancy designer watch and a few other luxury items he'd been holding on to, stuff that probably reminded him of when he had money and status. The total came to $1,800, and he'd put it all toward the loan, way more than his regular payments. I could tell from the way he texted about it that selling those things hurt him, that letting go of those symbols of who he used to be felt like giving up some part of his identity. But he was choosing to make real progress instead of protecting his ego, and that felt more significant than any of the revenge stuff I'd put him through. After that, we settled into this new routine where we'd have a budgeting call every Saturday morning. I'd pull up the spreadsheet I'd made, and we'd go through his income and expenses line by line, talking about where he could save money or what bills were coming up. It was boring and functional and kind of awkward, but that actually felt like success compared to all the toxic intensity of the previous months. No power games, no humiliation, no dramatic phone calls at midnight, just two people working through a financial arrangement like adults, instead of brothers with years of resentment between them. Some Saturdays we'd barely talk beyond the numbers, and that was fine. Around that same time, I noticed I was sleeping through the whole night again, instead of waking up at 3 a.m. wondering what crisis was going to explode next. At work, I could actually focus on my projects, instead of constantly checking my phone or worrying about what Gremlin might do that would end up in another HR meeting. My girlfriend mentioned one evening that I seemed lighter, less tense in my shoulders and face, and I realized she was right. Letting go of the revenge fantasy had lifted this weight I didn't even know I was still carrying around. The satisfaction of watching Gremlin struggle had felt good in the moment, but it was also exhausting, always waiting for the next chance to make him feel small. A few weeks later, my phone buzzed with a text from Gremlin while I was grabbing coffee before work. It was a photo of his latest pay stub showing his warehouse earnings, and next to it a picture of these scuffed budget sneakers he'd bought instead of the expensive designer ones he used to wear. The message just said, "Progress with no explanation or context needed." I could feel the fragile pride in that single word, like he was learning to value different things than he did before, not status or image or what people thought of him, but actual accomplishment from his own effort. I texted back a thumbs up and kept walking to my office, and it felt good in a completely different way than the revenge had felt. A few weeks later, I was walking home from the gym and passed by this laundromat on 5th Street. I caught my reflection in the big front window, and for just a split second, I remembered being Gremlin's footstool while he recorded his stupid podcast about work ethic, his feet pressing into my back while he talked about grinding and success. But instead of that hot rage that used to come flooding back with memories like that, I just felt tired and ready to move on. We were both in better places now, even if we'd never be close, even if there was too much damage to ever have a real brother relationship. I kept walking toward my apartment where my girlfriend was making dinner, and the quiet satisfaction of my rebuilt life felt more valuable than any revenge ever could. The smell of her cooking hit me when I opened the door, and I realized I'd rather have this boring, normal evening than all the vindictive satisfaction in the world. Well, turns out revenge is like microwaving fish. Satisfying for a second, stinks up your whole life later. Subscribe if you enjoy watching people learn that the hard way.